In the aftermath of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, Japan was plunged into one of its darkest periods in modern history. More than 15,000 lives were lost, whole communities were erased, and in Fukushima, a nuclear catastrophe unfolded that would echo across generations. But beyond the geological and environmental toll, a strange and less visible narrative began to emerge from the wreckage, a tale of spirits, spectral encounters, and ghostly manifestations that seemed to linger where the water had once surged. These were not just stories told by the superstitious or the elderly. They came from taxi drivers, priests, survivors, and scholars. They were stories of ghosts from Fukushima, the tragedy of March 11, 2011, left behind more than destroyed homes and radiation zones. It marked a moment when the boundaries between life and death seemed to blur. Survivors reported chilling experiences, feeling watched in empty homes, hearing disembodied voices calling out names in the night, and even seeing the dead walking among the living. These tales became so numerous that they formed a secondary folklore of the disaster, one deeply rooted in Japanese cultural beliefs about death. The afterlife and the idea of yūrei, restless spirits bound by unresolved emotions. Perhaps the most well-known set of accounts arose from the city of Ishinomaki, a place heavily battered by the tsunami. Here, a young sociology student named Yukai Kudo undertook research in 2016 to explore the psychological impact of the disaster on taxi drivers. What she uncovered was astonishing. At least 7 drivers described experiences where they picked up passengers who would vanish before reaching their destination. These weren't fringe accounts or easily dismissed hallucinations. The drivers had started their meters. In many cases, the journeys were logged and fares recorded. One driver recalled a young woman who asked to be taken to Minamihama, an area that had been completely levelled. When he told her the neighbourhood no longer existed, she reportedly asked, "Have I died?" before disappearing. The sincerity of these stories was such that most drivers accepted the encounters without fear or doubt. They saw it as their duty to transport these souls, if only symbolically. Other regions affected by the disaster began to report similar phenomena. In coastal towns across Miyagi and Ayudai prefectures, Buddhist monks and priests from other religious traditions were inundated with requests to perform exorcisms and spiritual rites. Many locals believed their homes were being haunted by those who had died suddenly unprepared, and without the closure of traditional funeral rites. In Japanese tradition, proper funeral rituals and memorials are vital for helping the dead move on to the next realm. The abruptness of the disaster, which swept people away without warning, left many without these rituals, and their spirits, it was believed, could not rest. Scholars began to take notice. Academics in the fields of sociology, psychology, and religious studies explored these ghost stories not as paranormal curiosities, but as manifestations of collective trauma. The mass death, displacement, and survivor's guilt created a psychic landscape in which such visions and experiences were not only understandable but perhaps even necessary. They provided a way for communities to express grief, to narrate their loss, and to spiritually reconnect with those who were taken so abruptly. In some academic papers, these experiences were classified as a kind of cultural coping mechanism, blending ancient spiritual beliefs with the raw pain of modern tragedy. In another striking account, a British urban explorer named Ben, who documented abandoned sites in disaster zones, entered a deserted school in Fukushima. The school had been frozen in time since the evacuation. Textbooks still on desk, coats on hooks, clocks stopped at the hour the disaster struck. In one of his photos, a faint figure appears to be standing at the end of a hallway, a translucent blur in the shape of a person. Ben, like many who venture into these sites, reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sorrow and presence. He described it not as fear, but as if the building itself remembered the children who once filled it. Some survivors, even a decade later, still avoid speaking of these encounters. There's a cultural delicacy around the supernatural in Japan. For many, acknowledging these events is less about seeking proof and more about preserving dignity and spiritual order. But when pressed, taxi drivers, monks, and civilians alike will quietly confirm the phenomena, often with a solemn nod or a whispered story. In one community, a woman in her 60s recounted a dreamlike visitation of her sister, who died in the tsunami. She described the visit not with terror, but with a deep sense of peace and closure. Her sister appeared in traditional white garments, smiled, and simply said, "Thank you." For her, that encounter became a pivotal point in her healing process. Stories like these suggest that not all of the spectral encounters are rooted in fear or unrest. Some are filled with reconciliation and love, acts of spiritual continuity, bridging the seen and unseen. The interplay of environment, spirituality, and psychology in Fukushima is unique. The nuclear disaster added another layer of unease, casting entire zones as modern wastelands. Radiation, invisible and silent, evoked a new kind of fear that naturally aligned with ideas of haunting and contamination. Abandoned homes, overgrown fields, and empty streets created a tableau of post-apocalyptic stillness, where echoes of the past felt unusually loud. These encounters also raise questions about the metaphysical weight of disaster. Does mass death leave behind an imprint? Can collective grief shape physical spaces? In a country where Shinto shrines stand beside Buddhist temples and ancestral spirits are honored during festivals like Obon, these are not abstract concepts but lived realities. The boundary between the material and the spiritual is more porous, more participatory. It's a nation where spirits are not simply feared, but acknowledged as part of the social and environmental fabric. From a Western perspective, such accounts might be dismissed as grief hallucinations or folklore amplified by media. But within the context of Japanese cultural belief, these stories form a vital postscript to the tragedy. They are part of how survivors remember, cope, and continue living. Whether these are true visitations or symbolic expressions of unresolved trauma may ultimately be irrelevant. What matters is the role they play in helping individuals and communities find meaning amid chaos. As time moves on, and Japan rebuilds both its infrastructure and its spirit, the ghosts of Fukushima remain not as horror movie spectres, but as mournful reminders of lives interrupted. They inhabit the silence between memory and reality, standing as unseen companions to those who walk the coastlines, ride the now restored trains, and pray at makeshift shrines. The ghost stories of Fukushima offer a profound glimpse into how a society deals with catastrophe, how it reconciles the past with the present, and how it honours the invisible weight of grief. They remind us that after the tremors have settled and the waters have receded, there are still echoes that demand to be heard.